The year is 1919. Two men have been commissioned by a local theater arts group to find a plot of land in the hills around Hollywood, California, to use as an outdoor spot for the presentation of musical programs and plays. They settle upon a shady, small canyon that is a popular picnic spot for locals known as Daisy Dell. They are particularly impressed with the contours of the canyon, which form a natural amphitheater, and its natural acoustics, which allow sound to bounce around for long distances. In the era before artificial sound amplification equipment, this is particularly important, of course. By the very next year, the first little concert is held on the spot, with these two ladies performing on top of an old barn door used for a stage. The owners of the new venue wasted no time in developing the site, though, and by 1923 a nice covered stage was in place, circled by seating for a good-sized audience. By the summer of 1926, the spot had become a very popular destination for music and theater lovers, where they could enjoy such extravaganzas as this production of Julius Caesar. By 1927, they had installed a fancy new stage in the shape of a pyramid, and the crowds had grown exponentially, filling the canyon. In case you haven't guessed by now, that pyramid was exchanged in 1929 for a stage with circular arches that gave it the iconic look the venue became famous for in the second half of the 20th century. Yes, Daisy Dell had become the Hollywood Bowl. Here's one of the crowds from 1928 at one of the famous evening Symphony Under the Stars concerts, performed by the resident Hollywood Symphony Orchestra. Evening symphonies weren't all that the site has been famous for. From the very beginning in 1921, it began hosting an annual Easter sunrise service, attended by many tens of thousands on Easter morning. By the 1950s, crowds of locals and tourists made the annual sunrise service a nationally known event. Until recently, I had always thought that the term Hollywood Bowl referred to that circular band shell that looks like a bowl on its side. But as you can see in this aerial photo of the site, the word bowl refers instead to the shape of the whole site, the bowl-like indentation in the canyon where the seating for the concert is laid out. From the photos I'd seen over the years of close-ups of the Hollywood Bowl, surrounded by hills, I had also always assumed it was way out in the country, miles from the downtown area of Hollywood. But as you can see from this aerial photo, it's actually just over the ridge from the busy city. In fact, it is just 1 mile from the famous Hollywood and Vine in downtown Hollywood. That was one of the main reasons the site was chosen. It was very easy for locals to reach right off a main street leading from downtown Hollywood. From the very beginning to the present, the Bowl is most famous for those nighttime concerts, such as this memorial concert in 1937 honoring the late George Gershwin, who had died just 2 months earlier in Hollywood. It featured the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra playing Gershwin hits such as American in Paris and songs from Porgy and Bess, and included Fred Astaire singing They Can't Take That Away From Me. The concert was broadcast to millions over the CBS radio network. But the Bowl also played host to other kinds of events, such as this War Bonds rally in 1944, and this election rally for Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1956. Eleanor Roosevelt gave a speech at the Bowl in 1935. Typical attendance at Bowl concerts and events was about 20,000. But in 1943, Madam Chiang Kai-shek of Nationalist China spoke to an overflowing crowd of 30,000 there, the last stop on a 6-week tour of America to urge American support for the Chinese war effort against the Japanese, and to beg for the U.S. to rescind the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The extravaganza in her honor that preceded her speech was planned by motion picture producer David O. Selznick. To kick off official proceedings, a squadron of bombers flew overhead, followed by actress Mary Pickford presenting Madam Chiang with a bouquet of roses. The Los Angeles Philharmonic played both countries' national anthems, with the Methodist Bishop of California offering an invocation. Author David Thompson called what followed next Scarlet in China, a solemn pageant titled China, a Symphonic Narrative detailing the actions of General Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, with over 500 Chinese performers taking part. Other actresses officially welcoming Madam Chiang on stage included Joan Bennett, Ingrid Bergman, Ida Lupino, Ginger Rogers, Irene Dunn, Deanna Durbin, Marlene Dietrich, Kay Francis, Judy Garland, Janet Gaynor, Rita Hayworth, Dorothy Lamour, Rosalind Russell, Norma Shearer, Barbara Stanwyck, Shirley Temple, Lana Turner, and Loretta Young. Madam Chiang followed with an impassioned 45-minute speech, the longest of her tour, describing the rape of Nanking, injured and dying children, and inexperienced Chinese soldiers fighting against vicious and trained Japanese. The Los Angeles Times described her talk, "It was a voice that must be heard."
Huge throngs pack Hollywood's famous bowl to see and hear Madam Chiang Kai-shek. Norma Shearer and Mary Pickford head a roster of cinema celebrities here to welcome China's First Lady. Chinese-American soldiers proudly serve as guards of honor. Spectacular tribute to Madam Chiang and her cause. A pageant staged by Chinese living in California. Now, standing beneath the Chinese symbol for victory, her face grim evidence of great strain, Madam Chiang makes a dramatic plea for the peoples of the world.
We shall not permit aggression to raise its satanic head and threaten man's greatest heritage, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all peoples.
By the way, her tour of the U.S. and the speech at the bowl were very successful. Huge amounts of financial support for the Chinese poured in, and 2 months after the Hollywood Bowl speech, the U.S. Congress abolished the Chinese Exclusion Act. The bowl played host to another world leader in 1951, Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion. In 1953, a reflecting pool was added in front of the stage at the bowl. It was 106 feet long, 36 feet wide, 6 feet deep, and held 100,000 gallons of water. The dramatic effect of the reflection in the pool at night is evident in this 1963 photo of Leonard Bernstein leading a bowl concert. By 1959, a fountain featuring both colorfully lighted water and a central gas flame of fire was added to the pool. Sadly, the pool and fountain only lasted a few years and were cemented over in about 1972 to make way for box seats and to eliminate guests' safety issues. For the first 2 decades, the bowl always featured classical music, but in 1943 it introduced its first pop music singer, with Frank Sinatra singing along with the orchestra. And from then on, the sky was the limit on who just might show up at the bowl, including that time when Big Bird led the orchestra. Yes, the Hollywood Bowl has been, for over 75 years now, one of the prime concert and meeting venues in the world. It's the place to be seen on stage if you want to be noticed by the public and the media. Whether daytime or evening, if you want your event to be famous, this has long been one of the best places to hold it. Which brings me to why I've taken the time to introduce you to the history of the Hollywood Bowl. I wanted to make it very clear just how prestigious it would be for anyone to be able to hold a special event at the bowl. Because now I want to introduce you to one of those very special events. And here it is. On October 16, 1961, a major extravaganza was staged at the Bowl to an audience of 15,000 or so. Tickets were free that evening, which was amazing given the celebrity-filled lineup that made up the program. In fact, it was a whole galaxy of stars of movies and TV from the past and present, as well as other celebrities from the film industry, the music industry, and even the political world. To name just a portion of the roster, there was Edgar Bergen, Pat Boone, Walter Brennan, Nat King Cole, Rock Hudson, Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, Vincent Price, Ronald Reagan, Cesar Romero, Jimmy Stewart, Tex Ritter, and John Wayne, along with producer Jack Warner, head of Warner Brothers, and movie director and head of a growing empire, including the Disneyland theme park, Walt Disney. The master of ceremonies for the evening was George Murphy, a man you don't hear much about these days, but well known to the crowd in 1961. I didn't recognize the name or the face when I first came across this story, but after I looked him up on Wikipedia, I realized I knew many of the ventures he'd been part of. He'd been a major song and dance man in the 1930s and 40s in musicals, such as this one with Fred Astaire and Eleanor Powell, Broadway Melody 1940. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild in the 1940s, a vice president of Desilu Productions in the 1950s, and vice president of the Technicolor Corporation. He was the director of entertainment for presidential inaugurations for Ike in 1953 and 1957, and for John F. Kennedy in 1961. And 3 years later, he was elected to the U.S. Senate. But maybe you're now wondering just what sort of program would feature such a hodgepodge of celebrities. It seems kind of odd to think, for instance, of Edgar Bergen and Tex Ritter and Nat King Cole and John Wayne all on stage together singing in a quartet. Surprise! Nope, these gentlemen were not going to be serenading the audience. You might say most of those celebrities were put on the program to serve as the bait in a giant version of the old bait and switch routine. It turned out that most weren't going to appear on stage to entertain at all, and they weren't even going to be part of the most significant part of the evening's program. They were all part of what you could call a warm-up act for the main event for the evening, a set of lectures. What kind of lectures, you ask? The same kind of lectures, and by the same speakers, as those that had been featured at the LA Sports Arena 6 weeks before in August 1961, as covered in the previous episode of this Strange Brew Series. That event had included a much smaller contingent of some of the same celebrities, who were used in part to attract an audience there also. In this photo, you can spot Ronald and Nancy Reagan standing next to Pat Boone, right under Lady Liberty's upraised arm, for the closing ceremony of that event. Yes, just like that August event, this extravaganza at the Hollywood Bowl was organized and presented by the Christian Anti-Communism Crusade organization, sponsor of the growing spread of schools of anti-communism across America. Headed by transplanted Aussie Fred Schwartz, shown here. A close Schwartz associate, Patrick Frawley, a wealthy California business entrepreneur, had arranged for most of the financing of the big LA school event at the sports arena. And when that was a great success, he came up with the idea and headed the organizing, financing, and promotion for the October extravaganza at the Hollywood Bowl. Frawley was certainly just the man to tackle such a project. Born in Nicaragua in 1923 to an Irish father and French-Spanish mother, as a teenager, Frawley represented his father's import-export firm, and by his early 20s, he was managing his own import-export company in San Francisco. He expanded his business in 1949 by purchasing a bankrupt fabricator of ballpoint pen components for $18,000. Ballpoint pens, which had been invented in the mid-1930s, were unpopular at the time. They leaked, the ink smeared, and most of them were expensive. By sponsoring the development of a quick-drying ink and a leak-proof pen design, the Frawley Pen Company revolutionized the public's perception of the product, which in the course of Frawley's career culminated in the development of the Papermate pen. But it wasn't just the improved technical design of the pen and ink that made Frawley rich. It was his knack for creating exceptionally effective advertising and promotional campaigns for the new Papermate retractable, leak-free, smudge-free pen. The new pen was introduced in 1951. 5 years after he paid $18,000 for the original ballpoint business, he sold the Frawley Pen Company for $15.5 million. In 2020 dollars, adjusted for inflation, that would be equal to $145 million today. Not a bad return on investment for a young man still just 32 years old. Then, looking around for further investment opportunities, Pat quickly ended up taking over the Technicolor Corporation, the film processing company responsible for the lush colors you may remember from big-budget movies of the late 1930s, with films such as Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, to the mid-1950s, in films like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and White Christmas. And at almost the same time, Pat became head of the highly profitable Eversharp Company, producers of Schick safety razors. When the new communist government in Cuba seized and nationalized a Schick plant in that country, Frawley was transformed into an outspoken promoter of anti-communist and other conservative causes. He became particularly enthused about the efforts of Fred Schwartz, and was a key player in pushing Schwartz's efforts into the national spotlight, using his money, his circle of wealthy and influential friends, and his advertising and promotional skills, including the October 16th, 1961 Hollywood Bowl extravaganza, which was dubbed Hollywood's answer to communism. This one-night event was Pat Frawley's brainchild. The idea was simple: a televised rally at the Hollywood Bowl at which luminaries of the film industry would demonstrate their devotion and their opposition to communist tyranny. Pat Frawley, to the end an ad man extraordinaire, could not help but ride the momentum of the school at the sports arena. Because Hollywood was often deemed by the right wing as a hotbed of liberalism, because it was seen as having been an important target of communist infiltration, because it was the main origin of American technicolored film spectacles, and because movie stars had had a great time at the sports arena, an even bigger red slamming celebration was now possible. The show was to feature some speakers of the sports arena school and a cluster of important Hollywood personalities. It will be a demonstration that, if there is communist infiltration in Hollywood, the majority of the film industry is comprised of patriotic Americans, Jim Colbert added in the press statement. Pat had also handpicked George Murphy to be the master of ceremonies. That was an easy choice, because Frawley had recently appointed Murphy as vice president at Frawley's Technicolor Corporation and an avid anti-communist also. Yes, this wasn't to be an evening of frivolous entertainment. It was a mass public patriotic rally that was Hollywood's answer to communism. Although a handful of singers did perform during the evening, most of the celebrities weren't there to give performances on stage. They were there to give personal testimonies on stage. They were there to raise their voices against the communist threat to America, such as Pat Boone. Just as he did at the Southern California School of Anti-Communism in August that year, he reiterated at the Hollywood Bowl that he would rather see his 4 daughters incinerated in an atomic explosion than to think of them living under an American communism regime. He got an ovation for that ringing declaration this evening at the Bowl, too. Most of the folks in the audience vehemently agreed with him, including these fellows who brought along their placards vowing that they too would be better dead than red. As you may remember from the previous episode of this series, Hollywood had been the target of anti-communism efforts since the 1930s, when the Dies Committee, the precursor to the House Un-American Activities Committee, began investigating communist influence in American society. In 1938, the Dies Committee turned its attention to alleged communist infiltration of the film industry. In 1940, a former Communist Party organizer named John Leach had provided the Dies Committee with a list of actors he accused of holding leftist ideas, including such famous stars as Humphrey Bogart, James Cagney, and Franchot Tone. As seen in this news clipping, Tone was one of the stars who cooperated with the committee's investigation. The pursuit of commies in the U.S. died down during World War II because of the need to cooperate with communist Russia in order to defeat Hitler. But as soon as the war was over in 1945, and it was obvious that the Russians were becoming more foe than friend again, the Dies Committee got right back to work. One of the first targets in its sights was the 1946 movie It's a Wonderful Life, which was accused of having elements that seemed to be anti-capitalist and therefore communist. Wonderful Life escaped official censure by Dies and his committee, but a growing number of Hollywood actors, actresses, screenwriters, and directors didn't fare so well. By late 1947, a group of such folks labeled the Hollywood 10 by the media ended up convicted of un-American attitudes and actions, and most were sentenced to prison for at least a short time. After release, they found themselves blacklisted by the Hollywood studios and their careers in shambles. And it didn't stop at just those 10. Any others whose reputations were tainted by investigation by Congress also found themselves blacklisted. Some found work by moving to Europe. Some screenwriters began writing under pseudonyms to make a living. Many never revived their careers. By 1950, it wasn't just official government agencies that investigated and reported on suspected communists and communist activities, both in Hollywood and throughout American society. A variety of non-governmental, unofficial, independent individuals and groups had arisen to do what you might call freelance work in the field, such as whatever group put out this little screaming tract. I've come to refer to this as the rise of the grassroots of the anti-communism movement. As the years went by, the official public governmental activities regarding anti-communism waned, especially after the fall of Joseph McCarthy in 1954. But these individuals and groups down at the grassroots level didn't wane, they thrived. One of the first of these efforts was by the small group that put together the Red Channels book that accused a large number of people involved in both the film industry centered in Hollywood as well as the newly budding television industry of being communists or communist sympathizers. The producers of the Red Channels book were a small group with an amazingly huge and powerful influence on the entertainment world. As noted in the previous Strange Brew episode, it was single-handedly responsible for the blacklisting of scores of people, some of them for over 2 decades, and the destruction of many careers. And another of the earliest and most influential of these freelance, grassroots efforts was the Christian anti-communism crusade founded by Fred Schwartz. This Strange Brew video series introduced Schwartz's crusade in the previous episode with its sponsorship of the Southern California School of Anti-Communism at the Los Angeles Sports Stadium in 1961. But that event was not the beginning of Schwartz's American efforts. They had begun clear back in the 1950s. While still based in Australia, he'd made several anti-communism speaking tours of the U.S. in the 1950s, and then moved the crusade headquarters to California in 1960. Which brings us to the Hollywood Bowl event later in 1961, that is being described in this video. You may still be wondering why I'm convinced it's useful to explore these events, which feel like they're just part of a distant, quaint past. After all, the Russian Communist Red Scare died way down, at least as far as media attention, by the 1970s. And for sure, the concern about any Russian communist infiltration into American society has been viewed by most people as totally gone since the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Why, Russia isn't even officially communist itself anymore. So who cares in the year 2020 what some goofy fringe characters like Schwartz were ranting about clear back in the 1950s and early 60s, other than as just bits of mildly interesting historical trivia? That's 60 years ago and more now. Practically ancient history. Why, it was before cable TV, home computers, the internet, and cell phones. I used to minimize it all myself as ancient history, but I don't anymore. Let's continue on with the story of Hollywood's answer to communism, and by the time we're done, you will understand why I don't. You may wonder why the Hollywood personalities who were part of the Hollywood Bowl rally were interested in participating. Various ones, no doubt, each had reasons, but we'll cover details on 3 of them. First, there was Ronnie Reagan, who had been active in the anti-communist movement since the time he appeared as what was termed a friendly witness at the 1947 HUAC hearings that led to the conviction of the Hollywood 10 and the blacklisting of so many in Hollywood. Ron wanted the world to know that the vast majority of his Hollywood colleagues were 100% Americans, and that he was very glad to see any communists or communist sympathizers eliminated from the business. Here he is being questioned in an HUAC hearing by a man named Stripling. In the transcript next on screen, Reagan mentions actors George Murphy and Robert Montgomery, who had both previously testified as friendly witnesses against some of their Hollywood associates at the hearings. Stripling: Are you the president of the Screen Actors Guild at the present time? Reagan: Yes, sir. Stripling: As a member of the board of directors, as president of the Screen Actors Guild, and as an active member, have you at any time observed or noted within the organization a clique of either communists or fascists who were attempting to exert influence or pressure on the guild? Reagan: Well, sir, my testimony must be very similar to that of Mr. Murphy and Mr. Montgomery. There has been a small group within the Screen Actors Guild which has consistently opposed the policy of the Guild Board and officers of the Guild, as evidenced by the vote on various issues. That small clique referred to has been suspected of more or less following the tactics that we associated with the Communist Party. Stripling: Has it ever been reported to you that certain members of the Guild were communists? Reagan: Yes, sir. I have heard different discussions, and some of them tagged as communists. From that time on, Reagan had been active in conservative causes that came against anything that smacked to him of communist or socialist ideology, including the recording mentioned in the previous film in this series, in which he was a spokesperson for the American Medical Association, coming against the bills being introduced in Congress at the time that it led eventually to the institution of Medicare. Because, of course, such a program was a version of socialized medicine, something only socialists or communists would approve of. Then there was actor Walter Brennan, who came to the Bowl to protest communism. He had started in movies as a bit player in the mid-1920s. By the 1930s, he had become a well-known character actor and won Oscars for Best Supporting Actor in 1936, 38, and 40. He spent the 1940s playing a sidekick or a villain in many films, opposite such actors as Henry Fonda and John Wayne. By 1957, he became known to a new generation of viewers, playing the patriarch of the McCoy family on The Real McCoys, which ran on TV from 1957 to 1963. Later in the 1960s, he was a supporting actor in several Disney movies and is well remembered for his part as the villain in the 1969 James Garner movie Support Your Local Gunfighter. There's not any evidence that he cared much about communism during the time of the 1947 HUAC hearings, or on into the 1950s with the McCarthy witch hunts. But something seems to have grabbed his attention by the late 1950s, in time to take part in the 1961 Hollywood's Answer to Communism rally. During the 1960s, he became convinced that the anti-war and civil rights movements were being aided by overseas communists from the Soviet Union through their support of local communist sympathizers and agitators, and said as much in interviews, and reportedly expressed glee on the set of his final series, The Guns of Will Sonnet, on ABC from 67 to 69, upon hearing the news that Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. In 1972, he supported the presidential campaign of conservative California Congressman John Schmitz over that of Richard Nixon, whom he believed to be too moderate. He was a member of the John Birch Society. Everett Greenbaum, a sitcom writer who was Jewish and co-wrote 32 episodes of The Real McCoys with Jim Fritzell, said, "What a bastard Walter Brennan was. We were there 5 years, and he thought my name was Phil, and he thought I was Gentile. He was always confiding in me. He'd say, 'You know, Phil, N-word, smells bad because they got poison in their pores and you can't get it out.' He also told me, 'Phil, I can tell a Jew by their back. Their back ain't round like ours. It's straight down.'" It's probably just as well for the HUAC that they never called Walter Brennan to testify. He would likely not have expressed his concern in as dignified a way as Ronald Reagan had. A third person who enthusiastically showed up at the anti-communist Hollywood Bowl rally was Walt Disney. His on-screen manner on his Disneyland TV show seemed so cheerful and light-hearted that you might be surprised at the level of anger and animosity Walt held against communists. The animosity came naturally and had its roots in the very early 1940s. On May 29, 1941, a new Disney film opened at theaters across the country. The lighthearted movie, The Reluctant Dragon, was actually more live-action movie than the classic animated films that Disney had been famous for up until then, such as Snow White. A long beginning section was actually a tour of the new Walt Disney Studios in Burbank, California, giving the audience a behind-the-scenes look at the process of creating an animated film, including the interaction of the animators and others involved. The dragon part of the movie was just one of several short cartoons integrated into the live-action plot. Yes, the movie made working for the Walt Disney Studios look like a lovely, cheerful, dream job for all those involved. But as it turned out, this was a fictional illusion, as a large proportion of the staff on the Walt Disney Studio went on strike on June 20th, 1941, right while Reluctant Dragon was still in the theaters. This included top animators who earned $300 a week, to some bottom-rung young women making $12 a week inking in the color on animation cells. They were protesting low salaries, poor working conditions, and the fact that none of the people involved in making Disney films, including those top animators, were given any screen credits for any Disney films. The only name given credit was Walt Disney. When Walt won an Oscar, he never even bothered to publicly thank any of his staff at the presentation, either by name or even just generally as a group, for their part in the production of the film. The animation staffs of other studios all got screen credit, but Disney had remained for 20 years a one-man show, and the staff was fed up with this, along with the pathetically low pay for many of the workers and increasingly unpleasant working conditions. Not only was there picketing right outside the Disney studios, some employees showed up in protests held in front of theaters where The Reluctant Dragon was playing, in an attempt to gather public support for a boycott of Disney. The animators took full advantage of their ability to draw popular Disney characters to embellish signs. Donald Duck and Pluto were protesting, right along with the strikers, as well as Jiminy Cricket. Inside the studio during the strike, those who were too fearful of the loss of income to join the strike toiled away at making the latest Disney film, Dumbo. Have you ever seen that movie? If so, you may remember that in the middle of the film, there's a scene where a group of clowns can be seen as shadows through the walls of a tent, boisterously laughing and drinking booze, and then marching off singing, "We're gonna hit the big boss for a raise." Some Disney historians are pretty sure this scene had been belatedly added to the plot of the film right during the strike to harshly mock the strikers.
Let's go tell the boss. Hey, let's hit him for a raise.
Yeah, sure. This is white real dough.
Oh, we're gonna hit the big boss for a raise.
Yes, we're gonna hit the big boss for a raise. Oh, we're gonna get more money. 'Cause we know that we're funny. We're gonna hit the big boss for a raise.
The Disney strike lasted 5 weeks and was only finally settled after the intervention of the National Labor Relations Board. Disney had to agree to a number of changes, including some salary increases and credits added to movies. But in the aftermath of the strike, the Disney staff went from about 1,200 to less than 700. And as time went on, any union men were the first to be let go if more layoffs were needed. And many of those actively involved in the strike ended up blacklisted in the industry. But what does all this have to do with anti-communism? Simply this. Walt Disney was absolutely convinced that the 1941 strike had been totally instigated by communists for nefarious reasons and resulted from them misleading his gullible employees. Why, he insisted, it couldn't possibly have been the result of any failure on his part to be a good employer. He literally viewed himself as the perfect benevolent father figure, and the staff of his studio as formerly loving and grateful family members turned into hateful ingrates by the lousy commies. And he felt this so strongly that he had held on to the grudge for 6 years and volunteered to speak out at the 1947 HUAC hearings about communist infiltration of Hollywood. Here's just a clip of what he had to say that day, which included accusing the National League of Women's Voters of being a communist front organization.
That conversation?
Well, I didn't pull my punches on how I felt. And he evidently heard that I had called them all a bunch of communists, and I believe they are. And at a meeting, he leaned over and he said, that you think I'm a communist, don't you? And I told him that all I knew was what I'd heard and what I'd seen. And he laughed and said, well, I used their money to finance my strike of 1937. And he said that he got the money through a personal check of some actor, and I don't know who that, he didn't even name the actor. I didn't go into it any further, I just listened.
Can you name any other individuals that were active at the time?
I don't believe it's a political party. I believe it's an un-American thing. And the thing that I resent the most is that they are able to get into these unions and take them over and represent to the world that a group of people that are in my plant that I know are good 100% Americans are trapped by this group, and they're represented to the world as supporting all of those ideologies, and it's not so. And I feel that they really ought to be smoked out and shown up for what they are, so that all the good free causes in this country, all the liberalisms that really are American, can go out without this taint of communism. That's my sincere feelings on it.
Do you feel that there is a threat?
I don't know as I qualify to say on that. I just feel that the thing can be proven un-American, that it ought to be outlawed. And I think that some way should be done without interfering with the rights of people. And I think that will be done. I have that faith. Without interfering, I mean with the good American rights that we all have now and we want to preserve.
Have you any suggestions to offer as to how the industry can be helped in fighting this menace?
Well, I think is a good start toward it. I know that I've been handicapped out there in fighting it because they've been hiding behind the labor setup. They get themselves closely tied up in the labor thing so that if you try to get rid of them, they'd make a labor case out of it. And I think if they can clean them out of the labor unions and get our unions, I believe in the American way of labor unions, and to keep them clean, we got to fight for it.
That's all the questions I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thus it was that 14 years after the HUAC hearing, Walt Disney was still hanging on to the grudge against his former employees and was pleased to be part of a public rally, along with many Hollywood associates, against those lousy commies. The first part of the rally that October evening consisted in particular of various celebrities stepping up to the mic to give short testimonies of how much they loved America and how much they hated communism. Most of the celebrities who participated at the rally were both conservative in general and Republican in particular. But to make sure to give at least the illusion that this was a bipartisan event, organizer Pat Frawley had made sure to start the session of longer speeches that made up the remainder of the program with a Democratic politician. This was the Democratic senator from Connecticut, Thomas J. Dodd. Thomas Dodd delivered the first of the night's four main addresses. The Connecticut liberal Democrat with hawkish attitudes warmed the audience by taking on the New York Times, the name of which generated spontaneous booing. "Let's get communism in true focus," Dodd exhorted a wildly applauding crowd. "Communism is total evil. It is all black. There is nothing gray about it. There is nothing good about it. Its ends are evil. Its means to those ends are evil." While attacking communism in the harshest terms, Dodd was careful to keep a bipartisan tone, ending on a quote from President Kennedy's inaugural address about the responsibility of defending the free world. As Dodd left the stage, an unexpected and unannounced guest speaker arrived to make an impromptu speech. His name was C.D. Jackson, and we will need a bit of a backstory in order to explain why he had shown up at the rally. Fred Schwartz's Christian anti-communism crusade had held its Southern California School of Anti-Communism from August 28 through September 1st. On the last day of the school, Life magazine hit the newsstands of the U.S. with an issue featuring new First Lady Jackie Kennedy on the cover, with an article about her elaborate plans for redecorating the White House. Buried in the center of the magazine, page 39 featured short news stories that included one on the new government program to pay corn and wheat farmers to not grow crops on much of their land, to cut back a growing surplus of the grains. According to the article, it was costing the taxpayer $1.3 million a day to keep that surplus in storage, so the solution was to tempt farmers with subsidies to get them to grow less. Elsewhere on the page was a mere two-paragraph blurb with the title, "Far-Right Revivalists." The glib article read this way: "A new kind of revival meeting serving the non-religious ends of an outfit called the Christian Anti-Communism Crusade is being held with full hullabaloo and political portent in Los Angeles this week. Like 9 other crusades in U.S. cities during the last year, it is presided over by Frederick C. Schwartz, 48, an Australian evangelist gone secular. Schwartz preaches doomsday by communism in 1973, unless every American starts distrusting his neighbor as a possible communist or communist sympathizer. Schwartz tries to appear less extreme than the John Birch Society, and he publicly disavows Birchism. However, his local steering committees have often included known Birchers. Schwartz himself landed in this country with $10 in his pocket in 1953, but he has built the crusade into a $500,000 business. Having persuaded 41 California mayors to proclaim this week as an official anti-communism week, he now plans to take the roadshow on to New Orleans and Columbus, then tentatively to Chicago, Washington, and New York. The staff at Life magazine probably thought this was practically just filler for the edition, which many subscribers wouldn't even bother to read. They were wrong. Which brings us back 6 weeks later to the Hollywood Bowl. After Dodd's speech, the unannounced appearance from C.D. Jackson brought the house down. The dashing, mustached, 60-year-old former Eisenhower advisor and currently Life magazine publisher had just made a 3,000-mile flight from New York. C.D. Jackson expressed what a great privilege it was to be here tonight to align Life magazine with Senator Dodd, Representative Judd, Dr. Schwartz, and the rest of these implacable fighters before he apologized on behalf of Time Life for Life's far-right revivalist article published a few weeks before. Regretfully, my own magazine recently published an oversimplified misinterpretation. I believe we were wrong, and I am profoundly sorry. Jackson could have stopped there, but he launched an attack on the Reds, for whom the Cold War is a deadly serious operation, while for us it's a largely journalistic cliche, adding that further concessions to the Reds in Berlin, Vietnam, Laos, or Africa was unacceptable. Which brings us to Henry Luce, founder and head of Time Incorporated, which by the 1960s was the largest and most prestigious magazine published company in the world. Luce had launched and closely supervised for decades Time, Life, Sports Illustrated, and Fortune magazines, along with the March of Time newsreel shown in movie theaters from 1935 to 1951, seen by 25 million moviegoers every month. As a result, by 1961, Henry Luce was one of the most influential private citizens in America. What does this have to do with C.D. Jackson's appearance at the Hollywood Bowl? Jackson's apology was once again Patrick Frawley's doing. Following Life's far-right revivalist article, the chic Technicolor boss called Henry Luce to tell him that the article had been unfounded, not factual, and harmful. He sent Luce some crusade literature and later flew to New York to meet with him personally. Frawley may have threatened to withdraw advertising from Life magazine in order to get Henry Luce to come crawling to him on his hands and knees. Henry Luce, of course, was certainly not going to stoop to personally going hat in hand and grovel for forgiveness on stage at the Hollywood Bowl. He sent his subordinate, Life publisher C.D. Jackson. But it's pretty impressive for the prestige of the Christian anti-communism crusade and Fred Schwartz that Jackson showed up, as he was no minor player in American society either. An expert on psychological warfare, he served in the Office of Strategic Services in World War II and later as Special Assistant to the President in the Eisenhower administration. After the war, he became Managing Director of Time Life International from 1945 to 49. He then became publisher of Fortune magazine. From 1951 to 52, he served as President of the Anti-Communist Free Europe Committee. He was a speechwriter for Dwight Eisenhower's 52 presidential campaign. He was assigned to be President Eisenhower's liaison between the newly created CIA and the Pentagon. From February 53 to March 54, Jackson served as advisor to the president on psychological warfare. During 53 and 54, C.D. Jackson was key in establishing the Bilderberg Group and ensuring American participation. Yes, the fact that this man showed up hat in hand at the Hollywood Bowl is a tiny token of the outsized influence that Schwartz and others with the Christian anti-communism crusade had, and in some ways still have right up to today, including, in particular, this unassuming looking gentleman. W. Cleon Skousen was up next on the roster of speakers. Cleon was a regular speaker at Schwartz's gatherings and had given a major speech at the Southern California School of Communism in August that year. W. Cleon Skousen took the stage and outlined his program to end the Cold War. He called for an investigation and a cleansing of the State Department, which he accused of having lost to the Reds, China, North Korea, Laos, Cuba, and more recently, the Congo. He rapped the United Nations, consistently using the term world planner, thus giving credence to conspiracy theories framing the UN for an impending world government. He called for a redrafting of the UN Charter, or we get out of it. Skousen also called for the outlawing of the Communist Party USA and termination of all diplomatic relations with the Soviets, as well as a Western embargo on shipments of food to red countries. He ended up on a positive touch by stating that his suggestions for winning the Cold War do not involve the United States in any massive warfare. Despite this reassuring thought, Skousen's presentation was considerably more virulent than Dodd's. The Los Angeles Mirror reported that Skousen's speech drew the most applause of the night. "It was a thrilling night," Skousen wrote in his personal notes. "The crowd was enthusiastic. They came to their feet several times during my talk and whistled and clapped their approval." Although I wasn't surprised that no recording seems to be available of the program that was held at the Bowl that night, I was surprised to find a video of part of the speech Cleon gave just 6 weeks before at the Southern California School of Anti-Communism gathering held in the LA Sports Arena. And from what I can tell of written records, Cleon's Bowl speech was pretty much a clone of the one he'd given in LA. Just to give you a taste of what Cleon's delivery was like in his heyday and what the audience response typically was to his messages, here's a short clip from that recording.
Unfortunately, General MacArthur and President Truman came to a misunderstanding, and I personally think probably through the intervention of this same group of individuals who had been so consistently wrong. When the whole thing is written, and when the historians have had a chance to put it all together, I think they will agree with the study that most of us have already made. One of the greatest Americans of our day has been General Douglas MacArthur. Now, when we had gone through the Korean War and finally fought it to an impasse, after having won and lost North Korea, we finally went to Panmunjom, worked out what treaty we could, learned once again the hard way how difficult it is to deal with the communist leaders, and then we entered into this new era in which we decided that we definitely would contain communism. Now, it was Republicans and Democrats united together that made that possible. This was a bipartisan program of unity. We will contain communism. And within about 18 months, under the direction of John Foster Dulles, who had formerly been on the Dean Acheson team, but who by the end of the Korean War had said, we have been wrong, we have got to move in another direction, not coexistence anymore, co-resistance, economically, politically, and if necessary, militarily. And it did contain fairly well until we took that tremendous gamble in 1959 and gave Khrushchev the prestige of coming to our country in spite of all the crimes he and his associates had committed and treating him as an equal in the community of nations. The heartbeat of the freedom fighters was almost stilled behind the Iron Curtain. And those of us who were receiving an occasional communication from behind the Iron Curtain realized that almost a lethal blow had been dealt to our friends who one day want to be free. Well, we've sort of struggled along, first one way and then another. The same people have remained in the State Department regardless of which administration has been present. And it was the same kind of thinking that put the embargo on Chiang Kai-shek, that turned right around and put the embargo on Cuba. It was announced, it was generated, initiated, and promoted right out of this same little group in the State Department. And as we lost China under one administration, we lost Cuba under another. Which leads me to feel that I hope one of these days someone will have the intestinal fortitude to stand up and insist that we have a thoroughgoing congressional investigation of the State Department.
Once the whistling and clapping for Cleon had died down and Cleon had left the stage, the second congressman of the night came to the lectern, Republican U.S. Representative from Minnesota, Walter Judd. Judd had given the keynote address at the 1960 Republican National Convention the year before the bowl event. Although he was an outspoken anti-communist and critic of any positive U.S. policies and actions toward Red China at the expense of the Republic of China on Taiwan, he was likely more liberal in some ways than most of the men involved with the Christian anti-communist crusade. He was a good friend of Harry Truman when Harry was a senator, and together they spent 2 weeks in 1943 making speeches in support of the United Nations, doubling up in hotel rooms at night. In Congress, Judd supported liberal international programs such as the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO. He called for removal of ethnic and racial restrictions in the immigration laws. His speech at the bowl tended to ramble. Judd celebrated Schwartz. Unfortunately, I've been a poor salesman all these years of one main idea, the same idea that Dr. Schwartz has written about so brilliantly and convincingly in his book, You Can Trust the Communists. He celebrated Dodd. We would welcome him in the Republican Party because he is the cream of the crop. He celebrated the United States. Only the alertness, the skill, the strength, the steadfastness, the character of the United States stands between them and our enslavement and that of all mankind. On the other hand, he decried the Reds. They know they must conquer the world if they are to abolish private property. They must take children from their parents. They must bring up the children conditioned, as dogs were conditioned by Pavlov. He decried the State Department. This is your State Department in charge of your destiny. No wonder we've got to have a school of anti-communism in Washington. I hope they will go to the school and listen to the old scratchy record. Communism is communism. After Representative Judd had finished, Christian anti-communism crusade founder Fred Schwartz came to the lectern. At most crusade gatherings, top speaking billing always went to Schwartz, who could easily talk for an hour or more without notes. But this evening was so packed with content, with testimonies from so many celebrities, musical interludes, and speeches already by 4 other men, Fred was left with only 10 minutes at the end of the evening to make his own comments. So he chose instead to just announce the upcoming crusade schools across the land and predict that the following spring, hold your breath, we invade the East in Washington, D.C. and New York City. He concluded by calling for a worldwide crusade against communism and announced that a permanent Latin American school would be launched to, as he put it, flood South America with anti-communist literature prepared by trained students on mobile printing presses. And then, after 3 hours of patriotic hoopla and scary speeches, it was all over. There's no doubt from Fred's point of view it was all worth it, even if he did have to cut his own remarks short. The October 16, 1961, Hollywood's Answer to Communism show was the greatest triumph of Schwartz's anti-communism career. Never before or after would the Australian be endorsed by so many prominent people. Within a few weeks, the crusade had organized the largest displays of anti-red gatherings in the nation's history. Schwartz was at the pinnacle of his influence, as witnessed by C.J. Jackson's retraction. The event had been broadcast live by numerous TV stations along the West Coast in California, Oregon, and Washington, and it was estimated that it was seen by an audience close to 7 million people, but it was ultimately seen by many millions more. The evening had been filmed, and later that year, and on through 1962 and 1963, copies were shipped east, with sponsors such as HUAC and the Technicolor Corporation making it available on local and regional channels all the way from New York City to Texas and Missouri, and throughout the South from Virginia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas to Georgia, Florida, and Louisiana. But you may say, that was all almost 60 years ago. The names of those involved at the Hollywood Bowl that night, outside of the famous entertainment celebrities and politicians, are totally unfamiliar now to the vast majority of the population of the U.S. The content of their speeches in 1961 about the dire threat of Soviet communism would be totally irrelevant in the modern age, with the Soviet Union totally gone and the President of the United States and the head of Russia now best buddies. Who but a small scattering of people in the 21st century have ever heard of Fred Schwartz or Cleon Skousen? With the Red Scare long gone and Russia turning into almost a capitalist society with billionaire oligarchs galore, you'd likely think that all those old-timey anti-communists like Schwartz and Skousen are totally irrelevant to modern America. Think again. This article with the title "Meet the Man Who Changed Glenn Beck's Life" appeared in Salon magazine in 2009. The man referred to in the title was Cleon Skousen. As the subheading of the article puts it, Cleon Skousen was a right-wing crank whom even conservatives despised. Then Beck discovered him. Already a wildly popular right-wing commentator, Glenn Beck, who had his own show on Fox News at the time in 2009, was organizing conservatives into what he called the 9/12 Project. The project was launched by a rally in Washington, D.C. that attracted an estimated 75,000 participants. The name of the project was a play on the 9/11 event of the terrorist takedown of the Twin Towers. As Beck put it, the day after the tragedy, on 9/12, we were united as Americans, standing together to protect the values and principles of the greatest nation ever created. Of course, he did not consider the election of Barack Obama just a few months earlier in 2008 to have been part of protecting those values and principles. As you can see from the title of this article, there is a direct connection between Glenn and the teachings of Cleon Skousen. As part of his project, Glenn was touting one of Cleon's books, titled The 5,000-Year Leap. First published in 1981, it had faded into obscurity by the 1990s, but a new edition was published in 2009, complete with a gushing foreword by Glenn. Almost entirely as a result of Beck's promotion of the book on his program, the new edition came out of nowhere to hit #1 on Amazon.com's book sales. It remained in the top 15 all summer, holding the #1 spot in the government category for months. Just during the first 6 months, 250,000 copies were sold. I'm suspicious that by 10 years later now, it may have reached sales in the millions. And this was only one Skousen title among several that Glenn promoted. But Glenn Beck is not alone among modern conservatives who have brought Cleon back to life. This article, titled Mitt Romney's Nutty Professor, was published in the Mother Jones magazine during the run-up to the 2012 election, when Mitt Romney was the Republican nominee opposing Barack Obama. Mitt's nutty professor was Cleon Skousen. As the subheading to this article put it, meet W. Cleon Skousen, conspiracy theorist, slavery apologist, Tea Party icon. Mitt Romney says you should read him. One more time, there is a direct connection between Mitt and the teachings of Cleon Skousen. 3 years later, in 2015, another article appeared in the Mother Jones magazine titled Ben Carson's Love Affair with a Nut Job Conspiracy Theorist. The article explains that this nut job was, once again, Cleon Skousen. This time around, it was his influence on neurosurgeon Ben Carson, who at the time was one of the contenders for the Republican nomination for the 2016 election. As you can see again, there is a direct connection between Ben and the teachings of Cleon Skousen. Carson swears by Skousen, who died in 2006. In a July 2014 interview, Carson contended that Marxist forces had been using liberals and the mainstream media to undermine the United States. His source? Skousen. There's a book called The Naked Communist, he said. It was written in 1958. Cleon Skousen lays out the whole agenda, including the importance of getting people into important positions in the mainstream media so they can help drive the agenda. Well, that's what's going on now. In January 2016, the Los Angeles Times ran this article titled, "Oregon Armed Protesters Invoke the Constitution," annotated by a conspiracy theorist. The article was about the ongoing standoff at a wildlife refuge in Oregon between the government and an armed group of occupiers of the refuge's headquarters building. Those occupiers were led by Ammon Bundy, a well-known figure among sovereign citizen circles, and various anti-government groups. The article was focusing on this tidbit of information about the occupiers. Search most photos of the armed occupiers who took over a federal wildlife refuge in Oregon, and you're liable to see a few common features. Beards, sure. Stiff-brimmed cowboy hats, too. And in many shirt pockets, a tiny bound volume. It's the Constitution, but not the way most people read it. It includes all 4,543 words inscribed by the Founding Fathers, with 18th century spelling and punctuation preserved. But the pocket Constitution held aloft by Ammon Bundy at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge contains some additional notations, courtesy of an anti-communist conspiracy theorist named W. Cleon Skousen. That pocket Constitution held up in this photo by one of the occupiers, it was published by an organization called the National Center for Constitutional Studies, founded in 1971 by, you guessed it, W. Cleon Skousen. The National Center's website mentions it has distributed more than 15 million copies of this little document in the last 5 years or so. Again, this little tract does not contain just the Constitution itself, but notes and commentary gleaned from Cleon's writings, which provide the reader with the very idiosyncratic explanations of parts of the Constitution that characterized Cleon's teachings about the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. Ben Carson gave up his run for the presidency in early 2016, and after Trump was elected, he tapped Carson for the position of Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Trump administration. And thus, Ben brought his enthusiasm for Cleon Skousen right into the White House. Here's the 2017 edition of one of Cleon's books, originally written in 1958, with a cover blurb by Ben that reads, "The Naked Communist lays out the whole progressive plan." And finally, here we are in 2020, almost 60 years after the Hollywood's Response to Communism rally, and 14 years after Cleon's death at age 93 in 2006. It seems pretty clear from my research that he had basically faded from view on the American scene by the late 1980s. But now, in 2020, a quick Google search makes it clear that the influence of the teachings of W. Cleon Skousen has startlingly become resurrected. Somewhat like the influence of the communist ogre as a bugaboo was jump-started again after World War II and roared into life in the Second Red Scare. There's a website for Cleon, run by his son Paul Skousen, where you can buy all sorts of Cleon memorabilia, including a DV set of 13 hours of lectures on just one of his many books. The resurrected Cleon has his own Facebook page, although you won't see any selfies of Cleon there showing what he had for lunch. Many different YouTube channels feature video recordings of talks by Cleon, with most of them gathering thousands or tens of thousands of views and wildly enthusiastic comments by viewers. Here's just a sample of 2 commenters responding to a video of a 1992 interview in which Cleon discusses his 1985 book, Making of America. This first comment is from 5 years ago. Watching this actually makes me really sad. I can't believe this man passionately gave so much of his life to better Americans with knowledge, and so many of us, including I, sat back and rode the wave to communism. Just because it's not affected us at the moment, what about our kids and their kids? We allowed ourselves to slip into the grasp of the enemy, and now so many of our brothers and sisters are so far gone into the bull crap spoon-fed to us by media. I pray we all wake up soon. And this is a comment from just 1 month ago. Tragic that he left us having to see the reinvigoration of socialism in America. I wish he was still here to help us reason with this immoral philosophy. I plan on buying his complete works. Thank you for this video. And then there's Amazon.com's bookstore, where you can choose from a large collection of scores of Cleon's books, including many now in Kindle version or on audio. They are also available on other outlets around the net, from Barnes & Noble to Walmart.com. Yep, you can drink your fill of the outpouring of W. Cleon Skousen's fertile mind. The description of the content of Skousen's 1961 message at the Hollywood Bowl I shared earlier in this video seemed a little over the top when I read it, but it wasn't all that different from other anti-communist rants typical of many speakers and writers during the Red Scare period. Certainly not way out in left field enough that one would be inclined to dub him, as Mother Jones magazine did in 2012, a nutty professor. But after doing further research to find out just what Skousen did espouse before and after that bowl message, in both his speeches and his extensive writings, I discovered that the bowl message was tremendously tame by comparison with much of his output over his lifetime. What was it about the teachings of a man referred to by some as a nut job and more that seems to have brought him out of cold storage in recent years, revived his teachings, and made him the darling of many in the current conservative movement in America? We'll explore the answer to that question in the next episode in this series. The Return of the Nutty Professor.